Hey everybody, this is Uncle Matt's D&D Neighborhood, and the guest in the studio today, I'm proud to announce, is Courtney Campbell. Courtney, say hello to everyone.
Hi, my name is Courtney Campbell. I'm a working full-time writer and illustrator. I manage the blog Hack and Slash. I stream on Twitch as Agonarch Artist. I have a Patreon and a Discord, and there are a lot of ways that you can follow me and what I'm doing and find ways to give me money.
There's a list of all kinds of different links to Courtney's sites down in the description of the video. And we have known each other a very long time because we were some of the early bloggers. And I ran across Courtney originally pretty much right when I started up my blog, and went over to his, and he had several tables was really what you were sort of focusing on at that point. And I didn't realize that you were also an artist really until we were talking before this show started. So run through, we're going to get to your top, and there's my dog. We're going to run through your top 5 DM tips, but first, if I can get you to just walk through more of the sites that you have, what it is that you're doing, and sort of catch people up on the full scope of what you've got out there.
Oh, yeah. Later on this year, I have 2 books coming out. One is from Autark Publishing, and it's Eyrie of the Dread Eye for Adventure Conqueror King. And I have a second book coming out called In a Deadly Fashion from Lamentations of the Flame Princess. I have another project I'm working on for them. I also stream 3 to 4 days a week during the day. It's a relaxing stream. I pretty high anxiety, high stress myself, so I try and have the most calm.
Can I just say that that's actual Jehovah's Witnesses or missionaries at the door? So that was probably the quickest they've ever been told that they can't.
Okay. Yeah. In addition to those books, I also have a zine called Mega Dungeon, which is about mega dungeons. I mean, both as art objects and conceptual spaces and actual sections of mega dungeons you can use in your own campaign. It's also the way I'm managing to publish Newman Hollow, my personal mega dungeon. I also produce Hexplore, which is where I draw detailed representations of hex maps and a lot of the sites and areas on the hex map as a tool to aid DMs for hex exploration. Like if your players wander off in a random direction, it's useful to have something with a lot of illustrations ready for them to go. I also blog regularly. I have a Patreon that supports me doing that, and I'm available for commission for writing and cartography work, and some people have been taking advantage of that, so I'm very happy.
Awesome. And then okay, so I have one question from that too. You mentioned art objects and conceptual spaces. If it's not going to tread on your 5 DM tips, what do you mean by art objects, but more particularly conceptual spaces?
That's a complicated question. The answer
I know if it was going to be easy, you know, then
I'd want to prepare everyone for that. So when we tell stories, the structure of the stories indicate what concern or need the psyche is seeking to fill. And in particular, with fantastic stories, with fantasy stories, they frequently are about deep. The messages that the games contain within them are psychological ones. Like, for instance, dragons represent greed, right? They're literally the embodiment of sin. So it's resonant in a psychological sense that way. Werewolves are a metaphor for, alcoholism. Vampires are a metaphor for rape. The Lich is a metaphor for society that won't get out of the way and let itself change. All these things, zombies, consumerism, like it just goes on and on and on and on and on. All these things represent the experience of playing D&D. When you play D&D, you sit around with your friends, you tell a story, It mirrors the human narrative in that you leave the safe space of the town or whatever, and you go into a dangerous area and adventure, and you retrieve wealth, wisdom, or knowledge, and you return back and become more powerful because of it. That's like the essential human tale of us striving to grow and overcoming challenges and coming back. So it's very, very resonant with the psyche. And a mega dungeon is a game that's entirely designed as a constrained space. It all takes place underground. And so when you look into the people who've written mega dungeons and the methods via which that they have tried to communicate with them, you realize that it's not just a bunch of fantasy environments. Mega dungeons literally in a concrete way represent the psyche of the person who creates them. They because there's so much content that you have to put in, it begins to resemble the author's own idiosyncratic being. So
I'm really thinking back now on some of the mega dungeons that I've written, and starting to worry about what I may have revealed about myself.
Exactly. And so when you're exploring a mega dungeon, what you're really doing is exploring sort of a metaphysical psychic space of the DM who's running it. It's not true in like a sandbox or wilderness. Obviously the DM is a large part of that, but the idea of this constrained space, I think, really ties it into sort of a psychological look at the mega dungeons who wrote them. Michael Curtis Stonehell, Zach with the Maze of the Blue Medusa, Gygax with Castle Greyhawk. You can see the verve and the personality and the essence and the mind and the spirit of the creator in the construct. And what you're doing when you're exploring it is you're coming to know another human mind. I think it's a very fundamental call to D&D, is that it's constantly tapping in to these base human cycles and desires. I mean, seriously, the structure of what we're doing is sitting around listening to a person guide us on what, in not a figurative way, but a very literal way, is a dream quest, right? It doesn't exist. We come up with a plan. You encounter challenges, you overcome them. There's a risk of loss. It's essentially, like a dream quest that we all sit down and agree to play.
Yeah, that is true. And fascinating. And I'm wondering whether we should just entirely ditch the 5DM tips and go deeper into the questions of the mega dungeon. But
well, it's all the same thing. Like if I'm talking about how to be a DM, I'm also talking about this. The structure of play at the table. I mean, what you're doing, right? Because you're guiding, right? You're facilitating. You're a neutral arbiter. Like you have a role and there are rules.
Except it's all what they're exploring is your own brain and psyche.
In a mega dungeon, I think in particular, yeah, you just have to pour so much of yourself into it. Like I've created it, and it like if you're going to create it, it takes a lot out of you, and people don't have like multiple mega dungeons in them. Nobody's out there working on their 4th or 5th mega dungeon. They're expanding on what they've already produced, right?
Let's go ahead and move to your first DM, the first of 5 DM tips. And I've got a feeling that we're going to be delving in the course of this episode into some of the deeper reaches of the mind that are involved. What is your first DM tip?
Well, I mean, so it's a milieu, right?
Okay.
Like your gaming group. There's a room, there's expectations. You have to be able to people are going to be putting themselves at risk. They don't know what the situation is. They're going to make choices. The choices could be wrong. This could leave them like emotionally exposed, right? Mm-hmm. I once had a friend that didn't want to read the instructions to board games out loud because she felt if she didn't understand them that it would be embarrassing. Mm-hmm. Right. So people are carrying this with them. So part of your job in the milieu is to really, I think, make everybody feel comfortable and make sure everybody's needs are being met and to facilitate communication so that happens. I think if you're doing anything else, you have to be able to manage the milieu. You have to be able to make everyone feel at ease and provide structure that allows people to play the game. I think that's the job.
So it's the point is that it is a social gathering, and that social um, the social milieu is what it is that needs to be comfortable for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's your job when you're DM. Now, I just want to say here, you're asking for my top 5 DM tips
Yeah.
on a YouTube show about Dungeons and Dragons. I'm pretty much assuming anybody that's watching this is an experienced DM. Like, if you're not an experienced DM, what I would say is, have fun, talk to your friends, you don't worry about it too much. Just plan out a couple things, go with the flow. We're not. I'm just assuming that we're talking with a group of people who have that vice. They run a lot of games and they're looking for something else. I mean,
Yeah, no, definitely. I
that's the
mean,
way I'm answering.
we're looking for the different people have taken different approaches with what kind of DM tips they wanted to give. Like Brendan LaSalle really focused on a convention DM, where it was more about the performance that you were giving. And so, so what we're getting here is the advanced DM tips. So number one is
I
that
mean,
it's what number so
I don't. I'm not Gygax. I'm not putting advanced in front of anything. I just answering the questions. I don't know. People like I have long ceased to assume that people are like me.
Mhm.
So they may find these helpful. They may think that I'm a weird, crazy bearded monkey. And if you do, be sure and watch me regularly on Twitch. I'll keep you entertained.
Well, the point about it being a social milieu is sort of my DM tip number one. My DM tip, my DM tip number two. My DM tip number one is basically to have fun. But number two is similar to your milieu tip, which is that you can use that since it is that basically you can make that eye contact, for example, is a thing that the various social gathering skills are something that you can use, that if you remember to do those while you're DMing, it's going to improve your game. And your DM tip number one is a little bit broader than that, because it's the issue of make sure everyone's comfortable together in the way that people are going to interact.
Okay, how many times have we been reading something like Reddit or a Dragon Magazine forum or like a forum post on EN or whatever, and you see somebody go, I don't think somebody's character is behaving the way I think they should behave, right?
Mhm.
And you got to imagine that those people are living in a world where they're experiencing frustration because they have something they're holding in their head that's not being met by other people, and they're not communicating about it. And you get all these conversations about railroading and removing player agency. And when you look at all of that, that's about are players doing something and not knowing the outcome of the behavior. When you take a look at all of that together, it's just poor communication. And so I do believe your first job is to make sure that everybody is both feeling comfortable to communicate and that they're communicating clearly.
Okay, so really that's an additional thing that I had sort of left out of my discussion of what
I mean, like, I'm not
communication is. Yeah.
It's just like anytime anybody is playing in my game and they do something and it doesn't make any sense to me,
Mhm.
what they're communicating is that whatever I'm trying to present to them, I have not presented successfully because they don't understand it. And so at that point, I'm just seeking with that particular person to understand where our disconnect is so that they can make an informed choice in the world.
So I don't know what it says about Skeeter Green that he ate the giant land squid that attacked them in the dungeon, but
But I think
not sure what he
players
was
generally try to
communicating.
consume as many things that can give them powers as possible.
Yeah, I once did an adventure in the pod caverns of the Sinister Shroom where I had the giant mushroom guy, but I definitely wrote into the description of the room that there was a large flat brazier in there with coal that you have, and then proceeded to describe here's what happens if you eat the guy, because they're gonna.
Hmm.
Let's move on to your DM tip number two. What's DM tip number two?
Oh, um, you have to be an impartial arbiter. You can't have an outcome in mind. I mean, obviously you can. I don't think it's wise.
This brings us, I think, to the quantum ogre.
Yeah, that's. I mean,
Let me-
fundamentally, I just read, like, so you write a thing, work on. I feel like, any philosopher, writes a thing and then people interpret it and it gets way off base.
I had a thing when I was talking with Gabor Lux, Mellon, and he said, yeah, I'm forever going to be known for that post about how to trace the path through the dungeon and make sure that it's not linear. And he was just like, you write something and it sticks to you forever. And in Courtney's case, I think it's going to be the quantum ogre, and it's come up several times in discussions with people. So let us hear about the quantum ogre.
Gaber, we can talk about Lux for a second. He's very talented.
Oh yeah.
If your viewers aren't already familiar with his work, they should check it out. He's one of the people I look forward to his material highly. I think it improves my own.
Yeah, me too.
It just is about, like, the quantum ogre is an example of the DM engaging in behavior to remove agency, like, in order to force outcomes. That's it. Like, it doesn't have anything to do with random encounters. It doesn't have anything to do with telling the DM they can or can't decide to do something. It has to do with you attempting to remove agency from your players. Like, at some point they're doing something, and instead of following through whatever the natural consequences of that thing are, you decide that they aren't allowed to do it, and instead of addressing it non-diegetically, instead of being like, hey, and just talking to them as a person, you engage in things in game to remove their agency so that things go the way you think they should go. And if you put that in another context, if you're hanging out with your friends and somebody is constantly manipulating you, how does that make you feel? When I play D&D, I'm sitting around and I'm playing a game with other players that has rules. I'm not looking to have somebody try and manipulate me. So I think it's not healthy, right? It's not a healthy behavior. So that's what the quantum ogre is.
And let me actually step back too, just in case people haven't read it or seen any of the mentions of it on the show. There's the reason it's quantum ogre was the issue of, if you offer people a fork in the road, and if they go this way, they're going to meet your ogre encounter, and if they go this way, they're going to meet your ogre encounter. And so that's why it removes player agency. And now, also, player agency being a concept that people might not be familiar with. What is it you mean by player agency?
I would not put forward your example as the example.
Okay, good. Well, give me the actual description of what the quantum ogre is.
The thing is that it's totally okay for the DM to be like, well, if they're just going to pick a choice, I'm going to put what I want there. But if they come to the intersection and they're like, okay, what do we see? And Ranger has a 25 perception and he looks for tracks, and the wizard casts a scry spell and they figure out where the ogre is. And then if you're like, well, they've taken that action. And if you're like, well, that doesn't matter, I'm still going to put it in front of them no matter what choice they make, then you're subverting their agency, right? Like, they get to decide what they do, and they have expectations that whatever their choices are will have fair and reasonable or logical outcomes.
How is that different from just a fork in the road?
Well, when they're not making a choice, you can't take away their agency. If they go up to a fork and there's no difference between the other direction, then the choice is essentially random. There's no agency of the players involved. You just and you can do that. You can have a list of random encounters, and you can go right down the list, and you can say, every time they reach a certain point, I'm doing the next encounter. There's nothing wrong with that. But if they stop and they gather information in the game environment and they do something else to take away their choice, to take away their actions and force them to do whatever you wanted them to do, well, I think that's shitty.
So there's the quantum ogre that has been brought up several times in different discussions, actually described by the guy who invented the quantum ogre. And so that
I mean, like, it's a wizard switch. The idea of invalidating people's choices has been around a lot longer than D&D.
You invented it. Come on, take the credit for it. It's all right, fine. But I think you encapsulated the idea of it in a way that a lot of people really hadn't thought of. You know, people, because you can approach that from different directions. I mean, I came close to that when I say that the most important part of adventure design is to offer the players meaningful decisions, with the keyword being meaningful. That you know, that's a factor of adventure design, but it doesn't encapsulate quite the same thing. I mean, it's clearly, it's right there in the same, you know, game space, but it's not the same as the Quantum Ogre. And I think just as a description, I think that caught on with people.
Yeah. No, it is a different thing, and I think that especially in early play, all gaming was discrete. Like there were definitely clear, distinct choices. Like when you look at the example of play in the early books, when somebody enters a room, the description given is like, you see item A, you see item B, you see item C. And then the game is the players decide what they're going to do about items A, B, and C. And sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes it's a trick. Sometimes it's a trap. Sometimes it's treasure, right? So I think that was very explicit. Like in the DMG, he talks about, oh, there's some rock formations in the water, you know, and there's some holes up on the wall. And when you go closer to the rock formations, oh, they see it's a skeleton. It's actually a skeleton in the water, because you're given explicitly triggerable, actionable items, and what you do with it and how you choose to approach it and get information from it, I think really is the play of the game.
And then what happened in the later game? Because you made a distinction between in the early game and the later game.
People wanted to do things besides play the game. Like, for example, like role playing in the game is to accomplish goals. You'll encounter one of those things. Thing one might be an NPC, and you might have a goal. You might have to interact. But then it got to the point where I think people spent a lot of time talking to each other in character around like fires and stuff, you know, and that's fine. I just don't think that's the game.
Okay. Because it can be, but you're saying that there's a core game.
Well, I mean, like you can make a game of whatever you want. I'm talking about D&D. Like if D&D is a game that has rules, and you can do whatever you want. You know, if you want to play football in your backyard, you can play flag football and have whatever house rules you want. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the NFL. Like D&D is it's very structured. It has an explicit structure. If you look at the original books, the players have a turn. It's literally called their turn. They get to move so many squares, and then there's a list of procedures the DM is supposed to follow. The game is very structured, and you know what? So people do whatever they want. I don't care. My feeling is just that if we're going to talk about it, we should talk about what it actually is. And the reason I think so is that I think it's important is because when you accept it that way, you discover whole new worlds of fun. Like there's really a lot of super interesting stuff that happens when you approach it like that. And that's what I've been talking about for the last couple of years on my blog.
And one of the things that you've, you know, been providing for people is that for those who don't necessarily jump to the various ways in which you can deepen that core game, you're giving them resources for it, because that's one of the hard things when you are.
I'm a concrete dude.
Yeah.
Like I'm a very, very, I'm comforted by concrete things. So that's what I have. I have a lot of procedures. I have a lot of thinking about how the procedures make the game fun for people. And I provide tools that I use to other people. Yeah.
Let's go on to DM tip number 3. What's your DM tip number 3?
I have to say, a meaningful campaign cannot be kept unless time is accurately tracked. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's important that there's a lot to that, right? It's not only
there's an awful lot
when you structure a game like that, what you've basically done is you've said this is a living world. And you guys are just in it. If you don't track time and you're just like, and it's the player's next adventure, it's like a comic book, which is fine, but it's less game-like. right? It's not like like when you do it where you have the time record and the players feel like they're in the world. They also feel like they can run around it and dominate it, and that's a really fun thing for a player. Whereas you don't get that feeling so much when you're playing linear adventure paths, right? You're just going on to the next encounter. But when you're given a living, breathing world and you're free to do what you want because your DM is impartial, it's quite fun because then you get to be whatever you want, right? Who doesn't want to be a pirate or like a lord of a castle? I mean, that's the opportunity to just go out and seize it. I have no investment in the matter. We're just going to find out what happens together.
Mm-hmm. And the time tracking comment goes all the way down to the comment about, first of all, what is the core game of D&D being procedural, because it doesn't, for one thing, it doesn't work if you don't track time.
Right.
One of the and now, you know, time moves in different ways because sometimes it's relevant whether you're on your turn moving or whether you're in a combat round, which hasn't,
absolutely.
that combat round hasn't disappeared. You know, but you went turn by turn, and then you also, the reason, and the other thing is that time needs to be important, and the reason, the way in which time was made important in that base core game was by wandering monsters, which a lot of people have a problem with the idea of wandering monsters. They're not realistic. Well, no, they're not realistic, but what they are is it's the thing that makes time important in a mega dungeon.
When you like, people get very frustrated when you first start turning, but then once they're in the environment and they realize that there's actual real threats and that their supplies are limited, that helps them become very connected to the game, to their players, and it increases the psychological resonance and your mind, right? If you've heard, everybody's heard about the cart and the invisible demon that's tricking you or whatever. Your mind doesn't understand the difference between being told a story about somebody being heroic and being heroic itself. Like, to your mind, if you heard the story, it puts itself in it, and then you feel good because you saw the movie or whatever. Well, when you're playing a game and you go on a heroic quest and you fail or you succeed, your brain, your mind, your sense of self, it doesn't understand the difference between it being an actual failure or success or a false one. It just assumes, like, you become invested in that outcome. And I think having a world that is threatening and responsive to behavior, it increases that feeling a lot.
Now, we've got one question from the chat room about what is the cart and the invisible demons, and not everybody does know that. So
Renee Descartes postulated that perhaps we couldn't trust everything because all of our senses were being deceived by an omniscient evil demon, and the only thing we can truly know is that we exist if we think. Hence, cognito ergo sum. It's classic philosophical proposition. And what I'm saying is that he's not wrong in that your brain can't tell the difference between a simulation and the actual reality. Because, I mean, obviously it can, you have memory or whatever, but it very easily can empathize or sympathize with an emotional experience that, say, a character in a movie is going through. And you empathize even more strongly when it's a character you're playing in a game. And if you succeed and have agency and achieve victory, then you as a human being actually feel more like you are an agent, more confident, more powerful, because you are, you know, your mind doesn't know the difference. You feel like you've actually achieved, you've gone out into the wild chaos and retrieved light and knowledge and returned it back to man. And dude, that feels good. Like, everybody wants to do that. And all we get to do is go to the supermarket, right? You've been to the supermarket, real exciting. So, like, when you sit down and play a game, they get to have this experience that we've just been denied because, well, what do we get to decide? What kind of food we want to buy at the grocer, what we're going to watch on TV? Those aren't very meaningful decisions, I don't think. And when you play, your mind can't tell the difference between reality and what you're doing, and it gives you a sense of doing something important and real because other people shared it with you. It's not solitary. The actions that you took and succeeded or failed at are real because you're held to account by the other human beings that you're playing with.
Right, and so it's a way of taking advantage of the fact that everything comes down ultimately to serotonin and dopamine, and it's deciding to be a hero rather than go to the grocery store.
Um, I I don't think we know enough about the brain to know what's really going on chemically. I think it's probably more complicated than that. I see a lot of people on the internet who are very confident, and I ask myself, have they tried, mescaline or peyote? Like, they don't know what reality is. Nobody knows what reality is. I find the certainty of many people frightening, actually, very concerning. Like, it's scary because well, I'm not certain of anything. Like, and if somebody is, it's a warning sign for me. It makes me concerned, little intimidated. Who knows?
I liked also the fact that you pointed out something that I think goes back to the Milia point that you did, which is that something is much more important to you if it's done in a group.
Yeah, that's why you
Because
get a lot of intense conflicts in role playing, is because people feel that their status is being challenged if they're not confident, if they're insecure. You can sometimes see pretty intense reactions from people who aren't emotionally healthy or stable. I've seen it before.
But you
I
can also
mean,
see, actually, what I was thinking of was the intensely positive reactions that you can get because victory happened with an
yeah,
entire
yeah,
group,
that's
and
why it's so
therefore
popular, man.
everyone that has participated in that victory, it's a bigger victory because of the other people who were in it than
Yeah,
it would be if you were playing a similar game on a computer and did the
sure.
same
Yes,
thing, but it was
it
just you.
matters more. Absolutely, that's why multiplayer games have longer lives. I mean, dude, if it weren't like some cool. But old Wargamer came up with a silly fantasy game. And when we were kids, we played it so much we couldn't stop thinking about it as adults. Like, obviously, there's something there. A million people watch Critical Role every week. There's 10 million weekly games in the United States. More people are gaming than ever. It's like, if it weren't such a powerful experience, it wouldn't still be around. It would have been a fad. It's not a fad. I think it's important.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there will be a point in the future where people look back and they say this is where the strand of D&D begins in terms of a collective sort of experience, and there obviously other role-playing games will be included in that, but I think
Mm.
it's all going to come back to because it's a method of people getting together that, I mean, it sort of existed before because wargaming, but
Yeah,
it's different.
yeah.
It's
No, I
different
mean, you're
from
right. I
wargaming.
know exactly where you're going. Yes, it
Yeah.
is. I agree. Correct.
All right. So point number 3 was time tracking, and I think there's more to unpack there, but I don't have anything that's springing instantly to mind. So let's run to DM tip number 4.
I I would have to say, I think gameplay needs to be the it needs to be agreed on. Like, there has to be table consensus when you're discussing things. I think at a table, the goal of everyone should be that the goal of everyone involved should be to augur the actual reality of the fantasy situation. Like, if your character falls off a cliff, the discussion should be like, well, this cliff is about this long. This is how much damage you're going to take. Do you think that's okay? And the player goes, no, I should take 1 damage. Like, the people at the table, their goal shouldn't be to win. The DM shouldn't be to kill the players. The players shouldn't be to beat the DM. The interests of everybody at the table, once something has occurred, is to achieve a consensus on what the reality of the fiction is.
I'm writing my notes, Courtney. You got to keep going.
Well, that's 4. That's the 4th tip.
All right. So we've got the goal should be to achieve consensus on what the reality is. How do you handle numbers in a game if people are looking at a
There's
rope
rules,
that
right?
they're gonna
But
hand over hand? Do you tell them what the probability is, or do you?
I generally, before people take an action, I give them like, just because they should be making informed choices. Now, I want, like, the players have options to do things to find stuff out. I don't give away anything, but like I let them know a range of possible outcomes from whatever they're going to do, from very mild to absolutely terrible, just so that I can make sure we're on the same page, right?
And you and I both do that. Because I also give people numbers,
I don't want to
as a shorthand. And there's certainly the other school of thought, which is that numbers sort of get in the way of things. You should just describe it's a frayed rope. If you're going to hand over hand to it, it's got some fraying on it. And I'm with you. I'm gonna roll a d6. You figure it's about a 1 in 3 chance you're going to fall.
We're playing a game. I'm not saying you have to give them numbers. And I want to be clear here. I think that a lot of people instantly misinterpret a lot of things I'm saying. When I was talking about encounters before, I don't just mean in a dungeon room. It literally can be item 1, 2, and 3 in a conversation. Like the scene, there's a structure for the players to do things. In this case, when the players take an action that doesn't match my understanding of the situation, I want to correct that mismatch. And so we go down to, you can go ahead into that corner, but because you're carrying a light source, anybody down the other side might see you, and they might have an ambush set up, and you could get shot with an arrow. You haven't checked the corner for traps. Are you sure this is what you're doing? Like you're understanding this the way I am, and then they can confirm or deny, and they can ask for more information. That's the game. It's a make a deal. I give them a setup, and they're like, well, what about this? What about this? You negotiate back and forth, you reach a consensus, and then we see what happens.
What else is involved in the sort of consensus that you are talking about? You gave the example of how much damage the
rules are not exhaustive. So very, very frequently you will come up with situations that are not covered by the rules, and those need to be covered by table consensus. So what will happen is a player will be like, well, can I punch him or knock him off the ledge? And so then I say, well, here's the situation as I see it, and then, well, oh, did you say you were pulling your dagger out earlier? You've got that in your hand. Are you going to drop it? We have a discussion about what the reality of the game is. And then we come to an agreement on it. Can you hold on 1 second?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So,
can you get me some water?
This is kind of like when I had the missionaries or Jehovah's Witnesses come to the door. Every once in a while, you just have something happen in the middle of a show that you got to deal with. My latest one was having the dog throwing up in the kitchen, making a really loud noise right when I couldn't get away, and that was a lot of fun. Having to listen to the dog. So that's there's always room for people to have a kid walk in or whatever.
Sure, I don't feel any compunction at all. What? Yeah,
I was feeling time.
Whenever there's a misagreement or like anything that the rules don't explicitly cover, you talk about it and address it as a team, like a table consensus. And part of that is becoming more entangled in a metaphysical sense with the group. When you have that discussion, that's how you achieve the cohesion of this fictional reality, which is really what gives the impetus to the strong satisfaction of being able to jump around in it like a crazy monkey hopped up on drugs.
Okay, so that also brings up a slight tangent on that, but there are you can toggle. Excuse me. You can sort of toggle the exhaustiveness of rules, or the what the things are you need to agree upon, by using miniatures as opposed to all the way theater of the mind, as opposed to the various directions you can do it with. What's your feeling on the whole theater of the mind versus using miniatures?
It depends,
debate,
right?
Because people will debate anything, but
it's about I really think it's almost universally a logistics issue. What is the simplest way we can present this information clearly? And sometimes the simplest way you can present that information clearly is with a detailed map and figurines. Sometimes that's what you need, because if you've got a big complicated fight, it's going to solve, because there's so much going on, it's going to solve a lot of disagreements. But if you're coming home and you get jumped by 8 orcs, we're not putting 8 orcs. I don't have time. Like, just, you're going to kill the orcs. You're going to lose a few hit points. We're going to have 10 combats tonight, and they're going to be 20% of our playtime. So just roll your dice, get it out of the way, like, kill these orcs. Like, they're not presenting a major threat. I'm going to roll, you're going to roll, some of them are going to go down. We can do that theater of the mind. But if you get into a situation where it's more risky and more dangerous, you need more precision. And so you float back and forth on that scale, I think. I mean, like, there's a fetishness to the, I mean, like, don't get me wrong, I have my little gnolls here. You know, like, I love the minis and the art and the construction of the dungeons and everything. But as far as play goes, that's secondary, I think.
And I think that's, the secondary is a really good way of.
I mean, like, having the camera in the dungeon, it's really brilliant. It's very good.
Thanks. Well, I mean, I do point out to people, look, that's because it's that's my way of getting everybody into the same mental, physical space when I'm actually gaming.
Because you're online, it's harder when you're online.
Absolutely. Yeah, and when I'm actually gaming,
they're beautiful. Like, the art of making the miniatures, I love it. I love all the stuff about it. But, you know, like, it's a thing I love that's tangential to D&D. Like, you know, like, they're related and they're often together, but one, you know, isn't necessary for the other.
Yeah, I mean, because I DM differently at conventions. With conventions, it's
potato
all
chips, dice, little glass beads. You know, this is now a tree. You know, we're going to turn this cup upside down, and this cupcake on it is the dragon. Yep. We're going to move it around the table. I mean, you know, like, whatever we need to get because you're playing with your friends, right? So toys are fun when you play. I don't know any other way to put it.
Toys are absolutely fun. I've played with the stuff for the D&D because I've got some things, like, I've got a couple of ships and things like that. And there have been a couple of sea battles where nobody was watching the sea battle going on.
You can tell that's part of the hobby. There's some of us that are really into it, you know, like, you do modeling and I do the modeling and, like, putting the miniatures together and priming them. It's a whole hobby in and of itself, and it's beautiful and fun to look at.
All right, let's move on to DM tip number 5. What is your DM tip number 5?
Oh, man. I don't know how to say this. You gotta love yourself. You gotta let go. You gotta learn to be empathetic and sympathetic. You gotta learn how to understand and integrate with other people to create an emergent, like, the thing that's so exciting about D&D isn't just the realness of it or the fact that you're doing this mythic thing around a table with your friends. It's also the fact that it's organic and surprising. And if you try and hold on too hard, or your players try and hold on too hard, and you're not all together in the endeavor of this extemporaneous exploration, then it definitely creates problems, you know, squeaky wheels. And so I would think that you really just have to accept other people who are going to do things that you would not do. And I say this as a person who's run an open table before. And, you know, the people are going to show up and they're going to be annoying or do their thing. And you got to love them anyway. You know, you got to be there with them and accept them if they're going to sit at your table. I mean, obviously, I'm not saying one should countenance abhorrent behavior, right? Don't do that. Like, if somebody's being inappropriate, that needs to be addressed immediately. But I'm saying, you know, you've got to accept that other people aren't going to have the same ideas, fantasy of you, and part of why you're sitting down to play is to get an opportunity to experience their ideas as well as share yours.
So, one of the ways of reading that approach is that because you are the person sitting in the DM's chair, and you are the one who is responsible for the social milieu, that you're basically in a very, very different social role than a regular player. And, we've talked about how the fact, in fact, your number one tip for beginning DMs was have fun. So, in a sense, you're there to play the same way that everyone else is there to play. But on the same hand, now that we're talking about the more advanced way of looking at it, you're almost saying that your role in that chair is a very, very big one, because you've got to accept different different methods of fantasy that are coming in. You've got to be able to adapt to those kind of things. It's almost like you've got to expand your soul a little bit for the game. Is that am I getting at the right point?
Impartial arbiter.
Right.
You gotta,
okay. That's
you got to let go. You got to
DM
be
tip
like,
number
okay,
2.
let's see what happens. Yeah.
All right. Because I just wanted to make sure, since you started by saying it's
No, I
that
think
it was a difficult point to think of and love
You
yourself. I wanted to.
You can summarize that last tip is just really listen.
Okay.
Like, you just have to hear what your players are saying, because they won't say it.
So you have to listen with better antenna than just your ears.
Yeah, you have to pay attention to not just to be supportive of whatever their idea of adventure or fantasy is. You share that. It comes together and it produces novel, new, emergent things, and that's super fun.
How well does this work? All of the things that you have said, I think, are things that will work better the better that you know your players, and will be much more nascent if you don't know them very well at the beginning. How
I don't. I would say that the outcomes are the same, but the satisfaction is it's like sex. It's like sex. I don't know what to say. Like, you can have sex with somebody and it'll be good, but when you know them really well and you have sex with them, it will be better. So, like, it's just like that. It's like, I don't think that there's any concrete difference between a new player and not a new player. You're not talking about psychoanalyzing them. I'm not a therapist. I mean, in my case, I was, but that's not the issue. The DM isn't a therapist, right?
That's
like,
a classic example of walking yourself into a conversational trap there.
No, I mean, but like, the point is that as the DM, you have to hear what your players are saying, and you can't do that if you aren't secure, right? Because you'll be too busy defending yourself if you don't feel safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that I think I've got a pretty good idea of what it is that you are talking about. I think I've got a pretty good idea about the sort of mind space, headspace that you're talking about. But give an example of how, in order for people to understand what you're talking about, give an example of something that's happening when that's failing.
Well, I think the thing you'll see is you'll have people arguing. They'll get upset. You'll see them shut down. Like, you know it. You've been at a table before where somebody got their, well, whatever metaphor you want to use, where somebody was upset with the situation and they weren't handling it appropriately. Yeah, everybody knows what that's like. That was I think a large part of, before we had Twitch and before we were broadcasting games, what they were talking about on the old Forge, when they were talking about incoherence and unhappy players. But the thing is that, yes, you see that, but man, I've been gaming for 10 years and that hasn't been anything at my table. That has more to do with the people than the games, right?
Mm-hmm. Do you figure that that's maybe one of the reasons why? Because the art of DMing has had some evolution since the way that it was described originally in the original D&D books. The Dragon magazine, before it was Dragon magazine, the first edition DMG, where the DM was often portrayed as being, on the one hand, the harassed and busy DM, and also the importance of the sort of authority of the DM, the blue bolts from heaven against somebody, who is doing something over and over again,
We
that's
were
wrong
kids.
or dangerous, huh?
We were kids.
Yeah.
Like that's not like
Well, not the people
lots
who
of
wrote the
shitty
books,
things
they
happened
weren't
to me
kids, but
from other kids when I was a kid. That's the thing. Is that when you're a kid, people will do things to you and you'll be like, oh, that sucks or whatever. But as an adult, that doesn't happen. Like everybody's an adult. So like I don't think it's changed. I think that type of thing was only relevant for adolescents and teenagers, right? Like when the role of the DM, I think, is still very explicit and very similar to as it was identified in BX or the Dungeon Master's Guide. I think that's all still excellent advice, and it describes the method of play that I'm describing. I mean, I'm a bit more spiritual about it, but fundamentally, you are sitting in a room with your friends, telling a story that you remember for a long time, and it feels like an adventure, and it's meaningful. Like all those things are true, and it works best if you like each other and you communicate well. I mean, a lot of what I'm saying, I feel, is very grounded in what the reality of the situation is.
well, that's awesome, Courtney. Thank you so much for being on the show. We're going to go ahead and cut it off here, but
It was so fast.
I don't know. Well, it does go fast, doesn't it? And
Was there something after the 5 DM tips? Was there not a second segment?
No, there's no
5 tips.
But what is going to happen is that I'm roping you into another show because
okay,
I definitely want to have you back on the channel again because I think there's an awful lot of stuff.
Well,
since you were thinking up your tips as you went, I got a feeling you got another 5 in you, maybe even.
Well, I mean, we're just talking about the art of DMing. I like lists of tips. That is not, I don't think, how one succeeds. Like if I wanted to match or something, I wouldn't go find lists of tips. You have to have like you have to experience it, and then you have to have questions about it. And you have to talk about it with people, and I think that this discussion is helpful for somebody who's at that place. They're running a game, and they're like, like they're looking to do something better or improve or have questions about more, metaphysical aspects. I did want to say before we end that I have a vested interest in my life goal of living indoors. So if your readers like your watchers, if they like this video, they should visit all my sites and give me their money.
And so once again, we do have all of the sites, all of Courtney's places down there at the bottom in the description. And also, the channel has a Patreon, and so there's all kinds of places that you can give money. Courtney's got an exhaustive list down below. So again, thank you for being on the show, and we'll get you back real soon. So to everyone out there, no matter what kind of Dungeons & Dragons it is that you play, imagine the hell out of it.